The problem of invading France was not a question of courage, but a failure of mathematics. In 1944, Allied planners knew they could land hundreds of thousands of men on the beaches of Normandy. The strategic trap was that they could not keep them there. An army of that size would require a city's worth of supplies every single day, and the great deep-water ports of France, Cherbourg, Le Havre, Calais, were heavily fortified German fortresses. They were suicide to attack head-on, and they would be useless, demolished ruins by the time they were captured. In this war, victory was not merely a matter of bullets. It was a ruthless calculation of tonnage. Now, let us return to the anxious planning rooms of 1943. The ghost that haunted every meeting of the Cossack, the chief of staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, was the 1942 raid on Dieppe. Dieppe had been a catastrophe, a frontal assault on a fortified port that resulted in thousands of Canadians being killed, wounded, or captured in a matter of hours. The lesson was written in blood. Do not attack a defended port. The Germans knew this. They had spent 4 years encasing the French coastline in concrete, steel, and artillery. This was the Atlantic Wall. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the German commander-in-chief in the West, was confident in this defense. He and his commanders knew that a modern mechanized army was a voracious beast. It did not just need bullets and bread, it needed oceans of fuel, mountains of spare parts, replacement tanks, new artillery pieces, blood plasma, engineering equipment, and winter uniforms. Without these, an invasion force, no matter how large, would grind to a halt. It would be a beached whale, powerful but helpless, waiting to be carved apart. The German strategy was simple. Let the Allies land on the open beaches. Let them expend their initial energy. Then, strangling their supply lines, the veteran panzer divisions held in reserve would sweep in and drive them back into the sea. The entire German defense was predicated on the Allies' inability to solve this single logistical equation. Allied planners, staring at their maps in London, came to the same dreadful conclusion. The numbers were staggering, almost paralyzing. Planners for Operation Overlord calculated that in the first 30 days, the invasion force would require over 1 million tons of supplies. This volume was incomprehensible. It was more than the entire civilian population of Great Britain was allotted in the same period. To sustain the advance into France, they needed to deliver a minimum of 12,000 tons per day, scaling up rapidly. This volume of cargo could only be unloaded by heavy cranes, moving cargo from the deep holds of Liberty ships directly onto solid ground, or quays, where they could be loaded onto trucks and trains. This required a deep-water harbor. The planners desperately searched for an alternative. They considered small fishing harbors, but they were too shallow and too few. They considered landing craft, the LSTs, which could run themselves onto the beach, open their bow doors, and disgorge trucks and tanks. This would be essential for the initial assault, but it was a horribly inefficient way to sustain an army. An LST spent days traveling, hours landing, and could only carry a fraction of the cargo of a deep-draft merchant ship. Worse, it was entirely dependent on the weather. A single channel storm could halt all beach landings for a week, and a week without supplies meant the invasion would collapse. This was the paradox. To win the war, they needed a port. But the only way to get a port was to attack it, and the lesson of Dieppe was that any such attack would fail. The overlord planners were trapped. They were being asked to land the largest army in human history on a hostile shore and supply it over open beaches, a feat that had never been successfully accomplished. They were being asked to do the impossible. The mood in the planning rooms grew dark. They had the men, they had the planes, and they had the ships. But they had no port. They faced the horrifying prospect that the great crusade to liberate Europe would fail not because of German panzers or the Luftwaffe, but because of tide charts, crane capacities, and the basic, brutal arithmetic of war. The entire invasion hinged on solving this one agonizing problem. They needed a harbor, and if they could not capture one, they would have to find some other way. The stalemate in the planning rooms was broken not by a general, but by an engineer, or perhaps by a flash of desperate, brilliant inspiration. The logic of the trap was inescapable. They could not take a port. The logic of the solution was, therefore, equally simple. They would have to bring one. This idea, when first whispered, was dismissed as madness. It was one thing to build pontoons or temporary jetties. It was another entirely to propose building a city-sized deep-water harbor in the quiet fabrication yards of Britain, towing it across the world's most treacherous and heavily defended channel, and assembling it on an open beach under enemy fire. The concept was so audacious, it bordered on fantasy. Yet it found a champion in the one man who had seen the alternative up close. Commodore John Hughes Hallett had been the naval commander for the disastrous Dieppe raid. He had witnessed firsthand the cost of assaulting a fortified port, and he was haunted by the lesson. After the raid, he declared with grim certainty that if a port could not be captured, then one must be taken with the invasion force. This radical thought found fertile ground in the mind of the Prime Minister. Winston Churchill was a man famously intolerant of the word impossible. He thrived on colossal feats of engineering and will. In 1942, long before the final invasion plans were set, he had scribbled a memo that would change the course of the war. He demanded that planners find a way to create piers for use on beaches, piers that could rise and fall with the tide. He was impatient with military orthodoxy. He did not want excuses. He wanted a solution. And so the impossible idea was given a name. It was codenamed Mulberry. The name was deliberately mundane, pulled from a list of random words designed to conceal the most ambitious civil engineering project in history. The challenge was not one, but three. First, the Allies needed calm water. The Normandy coast was famous for its violent storms and the punishing Atlantic swell. No ship could unload precious cargo while being tossed by waves. The planners needed to build a massive artificial breakwater, a harbor in the truest sense, over a mile long, dropped into the sea. Second, they needed a way to bridge the distance from the beach to the deep water. The Normandy beaches had one of the world's most extreme tidal ranges, falling over 20 feet. A ship that could tie up at high tide would be stranded in a sea of mud 6 hours later. Third, they needed the unloading platforms themselves. They needed massive, stable piers, complete with cranes and vehicle ramps that could function 24 hours a day, regardless of that massive, fluctuating tide. The problems compounded. How could they build a breakwater in the middle of the sea? They had no time to drive foundations into the seabed. The solution was brutal in its simplicity. They would build enormous hollow concrete boxes, some as tall as a six-story building, float them across the channel, and then strategically sink them in a precise line to create a solid wall against the ocean. For the problem of the tides, a genius solution emerged. The pier heads, the critical unloading platforms, would not be fixed. They would be giant floating steel structures connected to long, flexible driveways that snaked back to the beach. These driveways would be held up by floating pontoons. As the tide rose, the entire structure, the pier head and the long roadway, would rise with it. At low tide, it would fall, but the connection to the shore would remain intact. Trucks and tanks could drive off the ships, onto the floating pierhead, and then straight down the floating roadway to the sand, no matter what the sea was doing. This was the plan for Mulberry. In reality, it was a plan for two Mulberries. An American harbor, Mulberry A, would be built at Omaha Beach. A British one, Mulberry B, would be built at Arromanches. Together, these two artificial cities of concrete and steel were expected to deliver the 12,000 tons of supplies the invasion needed every single day. The scale of this undertaking was paralyzing to contemplate. It would require diverting Britain's entire industrial capacity. It would consume hundreds of thousands of tons of steel and over 1 million tons of concrete, all at a time when those materials were desperately needed for building tanks, ships, and bombers. It would require a workforce of tens of thousands, and it was all a gamble. Nothing like this had ever been attempted. The components were so large, so strange, that no one knew if they would even survive the tow across the channel. If they failed, if they broke apart in the first storm, the entire Allied army, stranded on the beaches of Normandy, would be doomed. With the concept approved, the abstract madness of the Mulberry Plan descended into the frantic, tangible world of draftsmen, welders, and civil engineers. They were not just designing a harbor, they were designing 3 revolutionary interlocking systems, each a historic feat of engineering in its own right. They had no precedent, no manual, and no time. The components were given their own code names, becoming a strange lexicon of the invasion: Phoenix, Whale, and Spud. The first and largest problem was the sea itself. To create the calm lagoon required for unloading, the engineers had to build a wall against the Atlantic. This was the Phoenix. These were the enormous hollow concrete caissons. The artificial breakwater, they were not mere blocks. They were sophisticated, hollow structures, meticulously designed to be floated, towed, and then methodically sunk. The engineers designed 6 different sizes of Phoenix to match the varying depths of water off the Normandy coast. The largest were gargantuan, over 200 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 60 feet tall, displacing 6,000 tons. They were concrete leviathans, 6-story apartment buildings laid on their side, built with internal chambers and a maze of pipes. They were, in effect, temporary ships. Each Phoenix was fitted with valves or sea cocks. When the engineers opened these valves, the sea would rush into the precisely calculated compartments, and the massive structure would lose its buoyancy and settle, slowly and, the planners hoped, controllably, onto the seabed. The design process was a race against the clock. Draftsmen worked in shifts, sleeping under their desks, calculating the stresses, the buoyancy, and the complex hydrodynamics of towing such a blunt object through the choppy channel. A single miscalculation, a single weak point in the concrete, and the Phoenix would crack, sinking uselessly in deep water long before it reached France. Next was the whale, the solution to the Normandy tides. This was the code name for the floating roadways that would connect the beach to the deep water pier heads. The man who solved this was Major Allen Beckett. He envisioned a vertebrate bridge, a structure that was both strong and flexible, like a steel spine. His design consisted of 80-foot-long steel spans, which were hinged together. They were not a traditional bridge. They were designed to float. To hold them up, the engineers designed hollow concrete and steel pontoons code-named Beetles. These beetles would be moored to the seabed, and the whale roadways would rest upon them. As the tide rose and fell more than 20 feet, this entire steel highway, stretching thousands of feet from the shore, would rise and fall with it. It was a bridge that breathed with the ocean. The challenge was immense. The connections had to be strong enough to support a 40-ton Sherman tank, but flexible enough to twist and articulate in 3 dimensions as the waves rolled beneath them. Beckett's design was a masterpiece of kinetic engineering. Finally, there was the Spud. This was the most critical component, the pierhead itself, where the heavy Liberty ships would actually unload their cargo. The pierheads needed to be massive, stable platforms, but they could not be fixed, or the tide would submerge them at high water and leave them stranded 60 feet in the air at low water. The solution was one of the project's greatest innovations. The Spud pierheads were large, floating steel platforms, 200 feet long, complete with cranes. But they were held in place by 4 massive pointed steel legs, 1 at each corner. These were the Spuds. These legs were not attached to the platform. They passed through it. The legs were lowered until they struck the seabed, anchoring the platform against the current. The platform itself, however, remained free to travel up and down these legs on rollers, rising and falling with the tide. A ship could tie up to the Spud, and the platform would automatically adjust, always remaining level with the ship's deck. It was a self-leveling floating dock. These 3 components represented a complete, modular, and deployable harbor system. The Phoenixes would create the breakwater. Old ships, code-named gooseberries, would be scuttled to create secondary shallower breakwaters. The whale roadways would snake out from the beach, and the Spud pierheads would sit in the deep water, ready to receive the cargo. It was a system of breathtaking complexity. More than 210 Phoenix caissons were ordered, along with 10 miles of whale roadway and 93 Spud pierheads. The sheer volume of material required was staggering. The project would consume over 1 million tons of concrete and nearly 100,000 tons of steel. The engineers looked at their blueprints, at the impossible physics they had just promised to defy. They had designed a harbor. Now, all they had to do was build it in total secrecy and sail it to war. The blueprints were complete, but the plans were an act of faith. Now, that faith had to be rendered in steel and concrete. This began the silent, secret war of production. The challenge was twofold. First, to build an entire city's worth of infrastructure in less than a year, and second, to do it in plain sight, directly under the watchful reconnaissance planes of the Luftwaffe. without the enemy ever guessing its purpose. The solution was not to hide the project, which was impossible, but to hide its meaning. The work was not concentrated in one massive, obvious shipyard. It was scattered across the whole of the United Kingdom, a vast, decentralized industrial effort. Over 200 separate contractors were engaged. The project became a national secret, hidden by dispersing it into the capillaries of Britain's wartime industry. Tens of thousands of workers, men and women, were mobilized into a new secret army. They were welders, carpenters, mechanics, and laborers. Many were men too old to fight, or young men exempt from service for their vital skills. The construction of the Phoenix caissons was the most visible and strangest part of the effort. These 6-story concrete structures could not be built in factories. They required dry docks, basins, and even commandeered riverbanks. Work began at sites from Southampton to the River Thames, and as far north as the River Clyde in Scotland. In London, the old Surrey commercial docks, bombed and derelict, were pumped dry and given a new purpose. Workers descended into the muddy basins to erect wooden formwork, a complex skeleton that would shape the hollow giants. The conditions were brutal. The winter of 1943-1944 was harsh. The men worked in biting wind and freezing rain, knee-deep in mud. They poured concrete day and night under the dim, hooded lights of the blackout. The sheer volume of material was astonishing. The project consumed 600,000 tons of concrete, 31,000 tons of steel reinforcement, and 1.5 million yards of shuttering timber. This was a monumental diversion of resources at the peak of the war. Crucially, the workforce was sworn to secrecy, but they were also kept in the dark. The workers had no idea what they were building. The components were so large, so bizarre, that they defied all logic. Rumors swirled through the canteens and work sites. Some thought they were building a new type of floating defense for the Thames estuary. Others believed they were futuristic grain silos, or perhaps, grimly, mass-produced floating coffins for a sea battle. The secrecy was absolute, enforced by the ever-present threat of the Official Secrets Act. A poster on the site walls warned, "The enemy is listening." Simultaneously, in steel fabrication shops and engineering firms across the country, the whales and spuds were taking shape. This was precision work. In towns far from the sea, welders fused the 80-foot steel spans of the floating roadways. They meticulously crafted the complex hinges and articulation joints that would allow the whale to flex and breathe with the sea. Other factories built the beetle pontoons to hold them up. These were separate, compartmentalized tasks. The workers welding a Spud pier head in a factory in the Midlands had no idea that a concrete leviathan was being poured in a London dock, or that the two pieces were destined to meet on a hostile beach in France. This army of 20,000 workers toiled under immense pressure. The deadline was the spring of 1944, a date that was immovable. They knew their work was vital, but they could not know why. They only knew that the tugboats arrived, took possession of the finished monstrous objects they had spent months building, and towed them away into the fog of the English Channel. As spring approached, a ghostly fleet began to assemble. The finished Phoenix caissons were towed from their construction basins to secret waiting anchorages in the estuaries and inlets along the southern coast of England. They were gathered near Selsey Bill and Dungeness, partially submerged to reduce their profile, camouflaged and guarded. To any German reconnaissance pilot, they would have looked like a strange, random collection of barges and sunken structures. They were anything but. They were the components of a harbor, an arsenal of architecture, waiting for the one signal, the one day, when they would be sailed to war. The secret army had done its job. They had built the impossible. On June 6, 1944, the world held its breath. The D-Day landings were a tenuous grip on a hostile continent. But for the men who had built the Mulberries, the battle had only just begun. The invasion was a success, but the race against starvation, the race for logistics, started on D+1. The signal was given. The strangest armada in naval history, a convoy not of ships, but of architecture, was unleashed. The first elements to move were the gooseberries. These were the block ships, a fleet of 55 aging merchant vessels and obsolete warships. They were given a final, noble purpose. Manned by skeleton crews, they steamed across the channel under their own power, braving the exact same dangers as the assault force. They sailed directly to the 5 invasion beaches. Once in position just yards from the shore, their crews opened the seacocks. They were deliberately, precisely scuttled. They settled onto the shallow seabed, their rusted superstructures forming an immediate 5-mile-long, jagged breakwater. This was the first line of defense against the waves, creating a narrow band of calm water for the landing craft. For the sailors who scuttled them, it was a one-way trip. They were now part of the beachhead. Close behind them came the bombardons. These were not the concrete phoenixes, but a different, more experimental breakwater. They were enormous floating steel cruciforms, 200 feet long, designed to be moored in a long line in the deepest water. Their purpose was not to stop the waves, but to break them, reducing the powerful Atlantic swell before it could even reach the main harbor. They were a risky, untried design, but they were the first part of the outer wall. Then came the main convoy. The great Phoenix caissons were refloated from their hidden anchorages along the English coast. The tugboat captains, civilian and military, began the most difficult and dangerous tow of their lives. These were not ships. They were 6-story concrete boxes, blunt, unwieldy, and heavy. They caught the wind like sails and wallowed in the sea. The optimal towing speed was a mere 4 knots, a crawl. A 100-mile journey across the channel would take over 30 hours. This slow-motion convoy was a target of breathtaking vulnerability. The channel was still infested with German E-boats, fast torpedo boats that hunted in the darkness. U-boats were still active, and the Luftwaffe, though battered, could still send bombers. The Phoenixes were the size of buildings, moving at a walking pace, unable to maneuver or defend themselves. They were protected only by a screen of Royal Navy destroyers and patrol boats, who treated these concrete blocks as if they were the most precious cargo in the world. They were. The procession was surreal. One tugboat captain remarked it was like towing a row of apartment blocks to France. Dozens of tugs, some pulling a single large Phoenix, others towing a whale roadway unit, filled the sea. This was the Mulberry B convoy, heading for the British beach at Arromanches. A second, identical convoy, Mulberry A, was heading for the American beach at Omaha. The weather, which had been marginally acceptable for D-Day, was already turning. The channel chop tossed the massive structures. Tow lines, thick as a man's arm, groaned under the strain. Several snapped. The crews fought to recapture the rogue caissons, knowing that losing even one would create a gap in their vital harbor wall. As this ghostly fleet of concrete and steel approached the Normandy coast, the soldiers fighting on the beaches looked up in disbelief. They were already accustomed to the shock of war, but this was beyond comprehension. Looming out of the sea mist, where only warships should have been, came a city. Concrete monoliths, taller than any building in the towns they were fighting for, were being guided into place. It was an invasion of industry, a sign that the Allies were not there to visit. They were there to build. The components had survived the crossing. They were on site. Now, under the sights of German artillery on the inland ridges, the most complex assembly job in history was about to begin. The components were on site, but they were not a harbor. They were a billion-dollar floating jigsaw puzzle dumped in a war zone. The assembly began immediately. This was the moment the project moved from the realm of engineers to the hands of soldiers. And it was a new kind of soldier who took charge. They were the British Royal Engineers and the U.S. Navy Construction Battalions, the Seabees. They were men who could build a bridge, pave an airstrip, or repair a dynamo, and they could do it while under fire. The work was methodical, brutal, and terrifyingly exposed. The beachhead was still shallow. German artillery observers on the high ridges inland, particularly above the American sector at Omaha, could still see and target the bay. The assembly of Mulberry A at Omaha Beach was a race against the guns. The engineers and Seabees, working from small tugs and workboats, were the most vulnerable men on the beachhead. They were attempting precision construction, sinking 6,000-ton concrete blocks, while 80 tornado shells sent plumes of water erupting around them. The first, most critical task was the sinking of the Phoenix caissons. This was a naval operation disguised as construction. A team of specialists, including Royal Navy divers who had surveyed the exact positions on the seabed in the days before the invasion, guided the tugs. Each Phoenix was towed to its precise charted location, a spot on a line that would become the outer wall of the harbor. Once a Phoenix was in position, the crew scrambled onto its flat concrete top. They were completely unprotected. They worked to open the valves, the seacocks, in a specific sequence. This was the moment of greatest peril. The sea rushed into the hollow chambers with a deep, echoing roar. The engineers were not just sinking the caissons, they were balancing them. If the water entered too quickly on one side, the entire structure would capsize or break its back, blocking the approach. The Phoenix had to settle slowly, evenly, until it rested perfectly on the seabed, a new, permanent piece of the French coastline. One by one, under fire and in a rising swell, the concrete monoliths descended, and the wall of Port Winston rose from the sea. Simultaneously, other teams raced to build the arteries. This was the work of the whale roadways. The 80-foot steel spans were floated in, connected by small crews on bobbing platforms. They were wrestling heavy steel, linking the complex hinges and attaching them to the beetle floats. It was a job that required a blacksmith's strength and a watchmaker's precision. This floating highway snaked out from the dunes, past the scuttled gooseberry block ships and into the deeper water now protected by the phoenixes. At the far end, the Spud pier heads were positioned. Tugs nudged the large floating platforms into place. With a scream of metal, the four giant steel legs were released, plunging through the platform guides until they hit the seabed. They were the anchors. The platform itself, now free to ride the tide, was ready. The speed was unbelievable. To the German defenders who still held the high ground, it was a form of witchcraft. A coastline that had been empty sand on June 6th was, by June 12th, a sprawling, complex industrial port growing by the hour. At Omaha Beach, the work on Mulberry A was fraught. The beach was more exposed. Not just to enemy fire, but to the raw power of the Atlantic. The Seabees struggled, fighting both the Germans and the surf. But at Arromanches, the British site for Mulberry B, the conditions were marginally better. The town and the surrounding cliffs offered a slight buffer. By June 14th, only 8 days after D-Day, the first cargo ship sailed into the new harbor at Arromanches. It did not drop anchor and wait for lighters. It tied up directly to a Spud pier head. Within minutes, its cargo was being lifted by cranes onto a line of trucks. Those trucks then drove, dry-shod, down the floating whale roadway and onto the beach, disappearing into the heart of Normandy. The artery was open. The first delivery of supplies was a victory in itself. It proved the concept worked. For the soldiers at the front, the change was immediate. The flow of ammunition, fuel, and, most importantly, medical supplies surged. The invasion force, which had been surviving on a trickle of supplies from beached landing craft, now had a lifeline. The engineers, however, did not celebrate. They were exhausted. They had worked for nearly 2 weeks straight around the clock in cold water and under constant threat. They knew they were in a race not just with the Germans, but with the sea. The harbor was built, but it was an arrogant, fragile structure, a monument to engineering audacity. It had been designed to face the summer seas. But as they worked, the men felt the wind shifting. The sky was taking on a pale, sickly color, and the barometer was beginning to fall. The harbors were working. For 5 days, a torrent of supplies had begun to change the tide of the war. At Mulberry A at Omaha Beach and Mulberry B at Arromanches, the tonnage numbers climbed. The delicate, audacious gamble seemed to be paying off. The engineers, exhausted, finally allowed themselves a moment of grim satisfaction. They had built a port on an open beach, and it was working. They had, it seemed, tamed the sea. But on June 19th, the sea reminded them that it could not be tamed. It began not with a bang, but with a sickening, oily swell and a wind that shifted direction, coming relentlessly from the northeast. This was the one direction the harbors were not designed to repel. A storm of this magnitude had not been seen in the English Channel in June for over 40 years. It was a freak event, a meteorological monster, and it was heading directly for the fragile, man-made coastline. For 3 days, the storm raged. It was not a gale. It was a sustained, violent tempest. Winds howled at over 30 knots, and the waves, funneled by the channel, rose to 20, then 30 feet. These were not the rolling swells of the open ocean. They were short, vicious, pounding waves, green with cold and capped in foam. The first components to fail were the experimental bombardon floating breakwaters. They were not strong enough. The colossal steel crosses snapped their massive mooring lines. Set free, these 200-foot-long steel structures became battering rams, hurled by the waves against the very harbor they were meant to protect. At Omaha Beach, the scene at Mulberry A descended into an apocalypse of steel and concrete. The American harbor was more exposed, taking the full, unblent force of the storm. The Phoenix caissons, those 6-story concrete giants, were lifted and pounded. The sea found microscopic cracks, forced them open with hydraulic pressure, and tore the structures apart. Some were breached and collapsed. Others were simply pushed out of alignment, like a child's blocks, punched inland by the force of the water. Then the waves reached the whale roadways. The flexible steel spines that had been designed to ride the tide were not designed for this. The sea picked them up and simply tore them to pieces. The 80-foot spans were twisted like scrap wire, ripped from their beetle floats. The Spud pier heads, the heart of the harbor, were smashed, toppled, and driven onto the beach. Hundreds of landing craft and small vessels seeking shelter in the harbor were instead trapped. They were pulverized against the wreckage or thrown 100 yards inland, left high and dry in a graveyard of ships. The Seabees and engineers who had risked their lives to build the harbor now risked them again in a futile attempt to save it. They were helpless. They could only watch as their triumph, their miracle of engineering, was erased from the sea in 72 hours of relentless violence. At Arromanches, the scene was just as terrifying, but the outcome was different. Mulberry B was marginally more sheltered by the Calvados reefs. Its gooseberry breakwater of scuttled ships held firm, absorbing the first shock of the waves. It did not escape. It was wounded, badly. Several phoenixes were cracked. The whale roadways were mangled. But the core structure held. The harbor was broken, but it was not destroyed. When the storm finally blew itself out on June 22nd, the silence was deafening. The sun rose on a scene of total devastation at Omaha. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley surveyed the wreckage. Mulberry A was not damaged. It was gone. It was a complete and total loss. The $100 million gamble at Omaha had failed. He made the immediate, brutal decision to abandon it. The American invasion would have to be supplied, just as the Germans had predicted, over the open beach. The storm had cost the Allies 800 ships, 140,000 tons of supplies, and one of their 2 artificial harbors. It was a catastrophe. The entire invasion, the entire liberation of Europe, now depended on one single battered surviving port. The Great Storm of June 19th was the Germans' best and last hope of driving the Allies back into the sea. It had succeeded where the Wehrmacht had failed. It had destroyed Mulberry A, torn the American supply line to shreds, and left the entire Overlord operation balanced on a knife edge. That knife edge was the single battered surviving harbor at Arromanches. The gaze of the entire Allied command structure, of Eisenhower, of Montgomery, of Churchill himself, fell upon this one small damaged spot on the French coast. It was no longer an experiment. It was the artery of victory, and it was leaking. The decision was made with ruthless clarity. The wreckage at Omaha would be abandoned, its mission now reduced to providing spare parts. The Royal Engineers and Seabees descended on Arromanches, not just to repair Mulberry B, but to cannibalize its fallen twin. Tugs and salvage crews in perilous operations crossed the bay to Omaha, where they wrestled with the sunken, twisted remains of whales and spuds. They dragged these mangled components back to Arromanches, using them to patch, reinforce, and expand the British harbor. The harbor was formally christened Port Winston. It was a fitting tribute to the man whose stubborn insistence had willed it into existence. And Port Winston, in the days that followed the storm, did not just recover, it thrived. It became a testament to Allied resourcefulness. The engineers worked miracles of improvisation. They welded, they patched, they rerouted. They built new connections and strengthened the old. What emerged was not a temporary jetty, but a genuine, sprawling industrial city on the sea. The Germans had failed to imagine it. The storm had failed to kill it. And now it grew with a life of its own. By the beginning of July, Port Winston was a spectacle of industrial might. The calm lagoon, protected by the now solid wall of Phoenix caissons, was over 2 square miles in size. Inside it, 7 Spud pierheads, operating on their giant steel legs, rose and fell with the tide, servicing the deep-draft Liberty ships. 3 of these piers were dedicated to unloading vehicles, allowing tanks and trucks to be driven directly off the ships and onto the floating roadways. 4 others were for general cargo, their cranes swinging 24 hours a day. The port was a constant, deafening roar of activity. 10 miles of whale roadways snaked through the water, a constant 2-way highway of heavy traffic. At any given moment, 7,000 men were at work inside the harbor. These were the men of the Royal Army Service Corps, the stevedores, and dock workers in uniform. They worked in 12-hour shifts, under the cold glare of floodlights at night, always aware that the blackout was a fragile protection. The Luftwaffe made sporadic, desperate night-bombing raids. Long-range German artillery still, on occasion, sent shells screaming into the bay. But the work never stopped. The statistics of Port Winston were the statistics of victory. The planners had hoped for 12,000 tons of supplies per day from both harbors. By the end of July, the single, surviving Port Winston was landing over 18,000 tons per day on its own. This was the fuel for the breakout. When General Patton's Third Army began Operation Cobra, the armored blitz that would shatter the German lines in Normandy, his Sherman tanks were running on gasoline pumped ashore at Arromanches. The millions of artillery shells expended in the battle for Caen, the blood plasma for the field hospitals, the rations, the ammunition, and the 400,000 trucks that would eventually land, all came through this single, artificial artery. Even when the Allies finally captured the great port of Cherbourg at the end of June, the victory proved the Mulberry concept had been essential. As predicted, the Germans had demolished it. The harbor was a ruin of sunken ships, mined basins, and wrecked cranes. It took engineers 2 full months to open Cherbourg to a fraction of its former capacity. During those 2 critical months, Port Winston was the Allied supply line. It was designed to last for 90 days. It operated for 10 months, even through the fierce storms of autumn. By the time it was finally decommissioned in November 1944, after the capture of Antwerp, Port Winston had landed 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and over 4 million tons of supplies. It had been for a time the busiest, most vital port in the entire world, built in a matter of days on a hostile beach. The legacy of the Mulberry Harbor is written not in steel, but in the map of a liberated Europe. It was an idea so audacious that it defied the logic of war, a solution as desperate as it was brilliant. It was a temporary, ugly, and magnificent city of concrete and steel that solved an impossible problem. The Mulberry was the physical manifestation of Allied will, an industrial-scale miracle that proved a war could be won by engineers as surely as by soldiers. It was the artery that kept the invasion alive, and that is why this tale, a story of logistics, of concrete, and of courage, must be told.